I still remember how the house felt after the funeral, too quiet, as if every corner had swallowed a secret. My brother's footsteps echoed down the hallway, sharp, impatient, while I lingered behind, touching the worn furniture as though it might hold my father's presence a little longer. I knew the moment was coming, and I braced myself for it. Tell me, if someone in your family reached for everything before grief had even settled, would you confront them or stay silent like I did? He didn't waste time. His hand extended toward me, palm open, demanding the key to the safe. My chest tightened. For years I had lived in the shadow of his hunger for more, always faster, always first. I thought maybe, just once, things would be different. But when I dropped the key into his hand, I knew nothing had changed. Not yet. And when he opened that safe, the silence that followed wasn't triumph. It was something colder, heavier, and it would alter everything between us. When the safe door creaked open, I expected papers to spill out, the kind with seals and signatures that could split a family faster than any argument. But nothing came tumbling. Instead, my brother's hand froze on the handle, his shoulders stiffened, and for the first time that day, he didn't have a word ready. That silence pressed against me harder than any outburst could have. I stood a few steps back, watching. He was always the first to grab, the one who acted before he thought. But now, he just stared inside, motionless. I wanted to ask, "What is it?" But the words wouldn't form. A strange part of me didn't want to break whatever spell had settled over him. Slowly, he reached in and lifted a small stack of envelopes bound with a brittle rubber band. They looked older than us, yellowed at the edges, written in our father's unmistakable hand. Not deeds, not banknotes, letters. My stomach turned because I knew those letters weren't meant for him alone. I took a careful step closer, and he pulled them tighter to his chest as if I might snatch them. That old reflex between us, always guarding, always assuming the other would take what mattered most. It was almost laughable, except nothing about that room felt light. He finally spoke, though his voice was low. "They're addressed to us." He peeled one envelope off the stack and held it up. My name was there, written in faded ink. So was his. Separate letters, two paths, side by side. My father's handwriting pulled me back through time. I remembered him sitting at the kitchen table late at night, bent over unpaid bills, his pen scratching quietly as if writing itself could solve the weight of his life. He was a man who carried burdens silently, who thought dignity came from not showing weakness. And now, even in death, he had chosen ink and paper to say what he couldn't bring himself to say aloud. "Go on," I said, my throat dry. "Open it." But he didn't. He just sat on the edge of the bed with the stack in his lap, staring down as if the envelopes were heavier than steel. I felt the tension thicken, an invisible wall between us. For years we had fought in whispers and silences more than words. This moment wasn't any different. So I reached into the safe myself. Alongside the letters were small items wrapped in cloth, an old wristwatch, a wooden rosary, a folded photograph creased so many times it was nearly falling apart. I lifted it gently. It was of our family, long ago, before our mother left, before our father's hair turned white from worry. We were standing outside the old house, smiling stiffly for a neighbor with a camera. My brother had his arm around me, back when we thought we were on the same side of things. I felt his eyes on me as I held it. For a moment, I wondered if he remembered that day, or if time had worn it out of him. "You see," I said softly, "this isn't about money." He shook his head, still staring at the letters. "Maybe it's worse." I didn't answer. Maybe he was right. Because words can cut deeper than any division of property. And if our father had left confessions in these envelopes, they could unravel what little thread of family we still had left. I sat down across from him. Then we read them together. His jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He slid one envelope across the blanket, the one with my name. My fingers trembled as I held it. The seal had weakened over time, but I hesitated. Was I ready to hear my father's voice again, this time with no chance to answer back? I glanced at my brother. His eyes looked sharper than I'd seen in years, but beneath it I caught something else: fear. We weren't kids anymore, fighting over toys or chores. We were two men sitting in the quiet of our father's room, about to face truths neither of us had asked for. When I finally tore the envelope open, the first line hit me harder than I expected. "If you're reading this, it means I failed to say it while I was alive." The words blurred for a moment, my eyes stinging. My father's voice echoed in my head, and for the first time that day I didn't think of the safe as a box of possessions. It was a doorway, and stepping through it was going to change how I remembered him and how I faced my brother for the rest of my life. The first page of the letter felt heavier than paper. My father's words looked careful, deliberate, as if each one had been weighed before he pressed his pen to the page. My brother sat across from me, unopened envelope still in his hand, watching my face for clues. I could almost hear the years between us, all the silences and unfinished arguments pressing into that room. My father's voice came alive as I read, "You boys never saw the choices I had to make. I shielded you from most of it, though maybe that was a mistake. A father thinks silence is strength, but silence can also turn into distance." I stopped there, the air catching in my throat. My brother leaned forward, restless. "What else?" I hesitated. Reading aloud felt like exposing a wound, one I wasn't sure either of us was ready to face. Still, I cleared my throat and continued. "If you felt me pull away, it wasn't because I loved you less. It was because I was ashamed of what I couldn't provide. The money ran thinner than you realized. Some nights I chose which bill to pay and which to ignore. And I know you blamed me for keeping the house bare. I heard the anger, though you thought I wasn't listening." I lowered the page slowly. My brother's jaw flexed, his grip tightening around his unopened envelope. He didn't look at me. "Sounds like excuses," he muttered. Part of me wanted to snap back, to defend a man who never defended himself. But another part of me wondered if my brother was right. Excuses or confessions, did it matter now? Our father was gone, and all we had left were these pages to wrestle with. I folded the letter carefully, setting it on the bedspread between us. "Yours might say something different. Maybe you should read it." For a long moment he didn't move. His thumb traced the edge of the envelope as if he could feel the words inside. Finally, he tore it open, but he didn't read it aloud. His eyes scanned the page quickly at first, then slowed. His shoulders sank. I waited. Silence stretched until I thought I might choke on it. Then he spoke, his voice rough. He wrote that he expected more of me, that I was supposed to look out for you. He looked up at me then, and for once his gaze wasn't hard. Said I carried myself like the world owed me, that he was scared I'd end up alone if I didn't change. The words hit us both differently. For him, maybe they felt like a judgment. For me, they felt like a truth I'd always suspected but never heard aloud. My brother had chased more, always more, but never slowed down to see what it cost. He shoved the letter back into the envelope, shaking his head. He didn't understand. He never understood me. I wanted to argue, but the fight drained out of me before it began. Instead, I reached for another item from the safe, a leather-bound journal, worn thin at the edges. The cover creaked when I opened it. Inside, the handwriting was smaller, less guarded, like he hadn't expected anyone else to read it. The first entry I found was dated the year after our mother left. "The boys don't ask about her anymore. Maybe they've stopped hoping she'll walk back through the door. I don't know whether that makes me relieved or broken. I want to give them everything, but I can't even give them her." I closed it quickly, my chest tight. That entry wasn't meant for us. It was a man's private grief, and holding it felt like trespassing. But it also made me realize how little we had ever really known him. My brother finally spoke again, quieter this time. "So that's it? No money, no deeds. Just this?" I set the journal down gently. "Maybe this is worth more than money." He laughed under his breath, sharp and bitter, spoken like the one who never wanted anything. That cut, though I tried not to show it. Wanting less didn't mean I hadn't suffered. It just meant I'd learned to survive differently. Still, I said nothing, because deep down I wondered if he was right, that maybe I had settled, let life pass by while he chased after it. The weight of the room grew unbearable. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the yard we'd once played in. The trees were taller now, the swing set long gone, but I could still see us as children racing barefoot through the grass. Back then, we hadn't known about bills, debts, or broken promises. We had only known each other. I turned back to him. He was still holding the letter, his knuckles pale, as if he couldn't decide whether to cling to it or tear it apart. "Maybe," I said slowly, "this isn't about what's in the safe. Maybe it's about what we do with it now." He looked up at me, eyes tired. "And what do you suggest?" I didn't have an answer yet. All I knew was that the safe had given us more than we expected. Truths, regrets, and a mirror we couldn't look away from. My brother didn't like silence. He filled it with quick movements, sharp sighs, and the scrape of the envelope against the table. I, on the other hand, let the quiet stretch. Maybe that was the difference between us. He tried to outrun discomfort, while I sat in it, waiting to see what it would reveal. "You think Dad meant for us to, what, talk about this?" he asked suddenly. His tone carried more confusion than anger, though I could hear both fighting for space. I shrugged. Maybe he just wanted us to see what he carried. Or maybe he wanted to keep us arguing even after he was gone, he shot back. The remark stung, not because I thought it was true, but because it showed how far gone we really were. The safe hadn't given us treasure, but it had cracked something open, something neither of us knew how to handle. I reached inside again. Beneath the letters and the journal was a small tin box. It rattled faintly when I lifted it. My brother leaned closer, eyes narrowing, as though this might finally be the prize he'd expected. Inside were old coins, tarnished from years of being handled and forgotten. Some were foreign, some local, and one H had a hole drilled through the center as if it had once hung on a chain. My brother groaned. "So that's it? Scrap metal?" I turned one over in my palm. I remembered seeing it once before, clutched in our father's hand the day he came home from his second job. He had said something about luck, about keeping a piece of the world in your pocket. I never asked what he meant. "They're not just coins," I said quietly. "They're pieces of his life, places he went, things he held on to." "That's worthless to me," my brother muttered. His words settled between us, heavy, worthless. I thought about how often he'd used that word growing up, about chores, about school, about the old car Dad drove. And maybe, without realizing it, he had used it about me too. I closed the tin and set it aside. "Maybe not everything's about value," I said, though my voice wavered. He smirked. "Easy for you to say. You never had ambition." I let the jab land without response. Fighting him would only circle us back into the same rut. Instead, I opened the safe again, my hand brushing against a manila folder wedged in the back. I pulled it out slowly, noticing the weight of its contents. Inside were documents, receipts, bills, even a faded eviction notice from years ago. My stomach tightened as I flipped through them. Dad had kept it all, every reminder of how close we had come to losing everything. My brother snatched one of the papers, scanning it with a frown. "I never knew we were this close," he muttered. "Neither did I admitted. For once, we were united in our surprise. Our father hadn't told us, hadn't wanted us to carry that burden. He had kept it locked away like the coins, like the letters. I sat back, letting the folder rest on my lap. Maybe he wanted us to understand how much he fought to keep us here. Maybe that's why he saved it. My brother's expression softened just for a moment before he closed it off again. Or maybe he just couldn't throw anything away. The dismissal bothered me, but I didn't push. Instead, I asked, "Why do you think he wrote us letters separately? Why not just one?" He hesitated. because he knew we'd hear him differently. The answer surprised me. It was honest, maybe the most honest thing he had said that night. I nodded slowly. "Do you want to know what scares me?" I asked. He didn't respond, but his silence was permission enough. That maybe I'll end up like him, carrying everything inside until it's too late. My brother looked at me, really looked at me, and for once his face didn't show defiance. It showed something closer to fear. He whispered, "What if I already am?" The words hung in the air, fragile. We both knew the truth. The safe wasn't about inheritance. It was a mirror, and neither of us liked what we saw in it. I put the documents back in the folder and closed the safe for the night. "We don't have to end up like him," I said softly, "but it means we have to stop pretending we're enemies." He didn't answer, but he didn't argue either. And in our history, that was its own kind of progress. When the safe door shut, the sound wasn't loud, but it stayed with me. It was as if I'd closed more and just a box. I had shut away the coins, the letters, the documents, but I couldn't shut away the weight they carried. That weight had followed us into the room, and I knew it would follow us out. For the first time in hours, I studied my brother without speaking. He sat slouched in the chair, staring at the safe as though it had betrayed him personally. His hands, usually restless, were still. That silence unsettled me more than his usual anger. I wanted to believe we had reached some kind of turning point, but if there was one thing the night had taught me, it was that nothing between us would shift with a single gesture. Change didn't come with keys or envelopes. It came with the slow, grinding decision to face what we didn't want to face. I cleared my throat. "Do you think Dad wanted us to find all of that now, or later?" My brother didn't answer right away. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Maybe he didn't want us to find it at all," he said finally. "Maybe it was just his way of keeping score." I frowned. Keeping score of what? Of everything he gave up. The idea unsettled me. I had always thought of Dad as a man who bore his struggles quietly. But what if all those documents, all those scraps of paper weren't just records, but proof? Proof for us to stumble on, like a reminder that sacrifice had a price tag. I sat back, uneasy. Or maybe it was his way of saying we're more alike than we think. My brother gave a dry laugh. "That's comforting." Still, something in his tone softened the edge. I wondered if he knew deep down that he was right about one thing. We couldn't explain away the safe. It was too deliberate, too organized for a man who had spent his life improvising through hardship. The night stretched on. We didn't move, as if leaving the room would mean leaving the questions behind too. At last, I spoke again. "What are you going to do with your letter?" He rubbed his jaw. "Don't know yet." I nodded. I hadn't decided about mine either. Part of me wanted to read it again, to see if I had missed something. Another part wanted to tuck it away forever, as though it was safer to let the words fade than to let them keep working on me. A thought surfaced, one I had been holding back since we opened the safe. What if the real inheritance isn't what's inside? What if it's the choice of what we do now? My brother turned his head slowly toward me. He didn't argue. He didn't roll his eyes or laugh. He just sat there, his expression unreadable. That silence was answer enough. We eventually rose, almost in unison, as if some unspoken agreement told us the night had ended. I locked the safe again, but my hand lingered on the dial longer than it needed to. My brother noticed but said nothing. Before he left the room, he stopped in the doorway. "You know," he said, "Dad always said you were the patient one. Maybe that's why he trusted you with the key." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words never came. By the time I turned, he was gone, his footsteps fading down the hall. I sat back down, the house suddenly feeling larger, emptier. The safe was locked, the room was still, but inside me something kept moving. That night, lying awake, I realized the real secret wasn't in the coins or the letters. It was in the silence between me and my brother, in the space Dad had left us, not just to fight over, but to fill. And maybe, in some complicated way, that was the test, not of loyalty or inheritance, but of whether we could find a way to carry his silence without becoming it ourselves. The days after that night stretched longer than they should have. I went about my routines, meals, errands, the quiet upkeep of a house that now felt like it belonged to no one, but in the back of my mind, the safe was always there. It wasn't just a locked box in the next room. It was a question that hadn't been answered. Every so often, I would picture my brother's face in that dim light, the way he looked at me before leaving. It wasn't anger that haunted me. It was the pause, the silence before his words, the weight behind his parting remark about me being the patient one. I couldn't tell if it was respect or warning. 3 nights later, I heard his car pull up again. The clock read past midnight. My first thought was that something had happened, that maybe he had made a decision about his letter, or perhaps he was ready to talk about the contents of mine. Instead, when I opened the door, he stepped inside without a word, his expression unreadable. He carried nothing in his hands this time. That unsettled me more than if he'd come holding the letter. "You haven't opened the safe again, have you?" he asked. I shook my head. "No. Have you?" He exhaled, slow and deliberate, as if he didn't fully believe me. "I keep thinking about it, about what else could be inside. There isn't anything else. We emptied it. That's what bothers me," he said. It felt unfinished. The word stuck with me. Unfinished. He wasn't wrong. For all the careful order of the contents, the safe had carried a sense of incompletion, as though Dad had left us the framework of a message, but not the message itself. We sat in the kitchen, the air thick with things unsaid. My brother tapped the table with his fingertips, a rhythm he always used when he was holding something back. "What if we weren't meant to find it together?" he asked suddenly. I frowned. "What do you mean?" "What if the safe wasn't for us at all? What if it was meant for someone else?" The thought hadn't crossed my mind before. I tried to dismiss it. Who else would it be for? We're his sons. Maybe that's the point. He leaned back, arms crossed, staring at me like I was missing something obvious. His tone wasn't angry. It was cautious, almost calculating. I didn't like the turn of the conversation. "If you think you know something, say it." He shook his head. "Not yet." The tension sat between us like a third presence. I felt myself grow uneasy, not because of what he said, but because of what he refused to say. It reminded me too much of Dad, the way he had carried secrets silently, never offering explanations, letting the rest of us live in their shadow. Later that night, after my brother had gone again, I walked back into the study and stood before the safe. I didn't open it. I didn't even touch the dial. I just stood there, staring, wondering whether the real inheritance wasn't inside it at all, but hidden in the gaps. What was missing, what was withheld, what was left unspoken. The longer I looked, the more I realized something that chilled me. My brother was right. It did feel unfinished. And if that was true, then maybe what Dad left behind wasn't just an inheritance. Maybe it was a challenge. The kind of challenge that could bind us together or break us completely apart. I couldn't keep circling the same thought forever. A safe wasn't supposed to feel like a question you couldn't answer. A letter wasn't supposed to weigh heavier than the person who wrote it. So when my brother called the following week and asked if we could meet at the house again, I agreed. He arrived in the late afternoon this time. No car lights cutting into the night, no hushed entry. Just a man walking into the kitchen he once grew up in, carrying the years between us like baggage. We sat at the table without ceremony. He placed his folded letter in front of him, still sealed, the edges slightly worn now. I put mine next to it. For the first time, we looked at both together. "You ever think about opening it?" I asked. "Every day," he admitted. "And every day I stop myself. Not because I don't want to know, but because I'm not sure I'll like what I find." "That's not like you," I said. He gave me a small shrug. "Maybe I've changed. Or maybe I'm just tired of being the one who forces answers out of things that don't want to be explained." The honesty in his tone surprised me. We weren't good at this, talking plainly. We grew up learning silence before explanation, distance before vulnerability. Dad wasn't cruel, but he wasn't open either. That rubbed off on us. I tapped my envelope with my finger. If you opened mine and it was empty, what would you think? He studied me, then the letter. I'd think Dad wanted you to find meaning in the waiting. Or in me. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. You really think he planned it like that? You don't. The pause stretched long enough to answer for me. I didn't want to admit it, but part of me did think that. We let the silence settle again, then drifted into safer ground. Memories of growing up, arguments we'd had over nothing, Dad's small habits that irritated us both. It was almost comforting, like we were slipping back into an old rhythm. But then he leaned forward and lowered his voice. You know, the more I think about it, the more I wonder if we missed something in the safe. I frowned. We checked it, twice. Not what was in it, what wasn't. He explained what he meant. Our father had kept every piece of paper, every bill, every note, no matter how trivial. Yet, when we opened the safe, there had been only 2 letters, nothing else. No legal papers, no bank slips, no copies of deeds. For a man who lived by record-keeping, the absence was glaring. It's not like him, my brother said, unless he moved things before he died. And if he did, where would they be? I asked. He looked around the study, then back at me. That's the question, isn't it? I felt the tension return, not in the form of anger this time, but in curiosity. The kind that pulls you forward even when you know you might regret what you find. All right, I said. We search. One last time. Together. So we did. We opened drawers, checked behind books, shifted old boxes. The house gave up nothing. Only the same old dust and memories. But when I moved a stack of photo albums from the bottom of the cabinet, I found a small wooden box I'd never noticed before. It wasn't locked. Inside were a handful of keys, each labeled with a piece of tape. Most were for doors we already knew, but one was different, marked only with the number 2. I held it up. My brother stared at it like it was a riddle. Another safe? Or a drawer we overlooked, I said. We searched again, following the trail of possibilities that key suggested. It didn't fit anything in the study, nor the cabinets in the bedroom. But when we finally checked the garage tucked in the corner behind the workbench, there it was, a metal lockbox we hadn't touched in years. The key slid in smooth, like it had been waiting. We didn't open it right away. Both of us stood there looking at each other, holding the weight of what it could mean. It wasn't just about what was inside, it was about what it might confirm, that Dad had planned this layer by layer, leaving us not just with possessions, but with puzzles. And in that moment, I realized something. Maybe the safe wasn't unfinished after all. Maybe it was just the first step. The lockbox sat on the workbench between us, quiet and unassuming, like it had been waiting for years without complaint. My brother ran his hand along the lid as if touching it might give him an answer before opening it. I didn't reach for it right away. I was still thinking about everything that had led us here. Dad's silence, the safe, the letters, the unfinished feeling that kept dragging us deeper. It was strange. For so long I thought of inheritance as something simple, divided property, paperwork, maybe a few keepsakes. But this didn't feel like inheritance anymore. It felt like instruction. Like Dad had been teaching us something without speaking, letting the process itself be the lesson. My brother finally broke the silence. You ever wonder if he knew exactly how this would play out? Every day, I said. But knowing him, he probably counted on us fighting about it. That was the only thing he could be sure of. My brother gave a small laugh, one that carried both recognition and sadness. We always did, didn't we? That was true. From the time we were boys, it seemed like we were built to oppose each other. Who got the bigger room? Who got the first turn at anything? Who earned Dad's approval more often? None of it mattered now, and yet it still shaped the way we stood in this garage, staring at a locked box like it could rewrite our history. I thought about Dad's way of teaching. He rarely lectured, but he showed us by example, or by omission. If he wanted us to be patient, he made us wait. If he wanted us to value honesty, he withheld it until the lack of it gnawed at us. The safe and the letters felt like the last version of that pattern. Maybe the real test isn't what's inside, I said. Maybe it's whether we can face it together. My brother looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. That would be a first. We didn't open the box yet. Instead, we sat on 2 old stools, letting the air settle around us. He asked me if I remembered the last time Dad brought us into the garage. I did. It was years ago, before Dad's health began to fail. He had us fix an old lawnmower together, even though it barely ran anymore. He didn't care about the machine. He cared about whether we could work side by side without tearing each other apart. We failed that day. I stormed out. He finished the job alone, and Dad never brought it up again. Sitting here now, I realized maybe that moment wasn't about the mower at all. It was about the 2 of us, about this. The thought unsettled me. If Dad had been planning this carefully, leaving trails and half-answers, then maybe he had been thinking about the day after his death for much longer than we wanted to believe. Maybe the safe wasn't just a safe, and the lockbox wasn't just a lockbox. Maybe they were mirrors, forcing us to look at what was broken between us. I finally spoke again. What if opening it doesn't fix anything? What if it makes things worse? My brother leaned back, his arms crossed. Then at least we'll know. Ignorance is worse than anger. That sounded like him, always pushing toward confrontation, even when the outcome was uncertain. I wasn't sure if I admired it or resented it. We didn't open the box that evening. Neither of us said why. It was as if we both knew we weren't ready. Instead, we carried it inside and set it on the dining table right where the safe had been. For a long time, we just sat there, looking at it, the 2 sealed letters still beside it. It struck me then that the objects weren't really what mattered. It was the silence they created, the space between questions and answers. Dad had left us with that silence, and we were still trying to decide what to fill it with: resentment, forgiveness, or something in between. That night, after my brother left again, I stayed at the table. The house felt heavier than ever. I thought about calling someone, an old friend, maybe even a lawyer, but in the end, I stayed quiet. It didn't feel like anyone outside this family could solve what was inside it. I looked at the lockbox one more time before turning off the lights. For the first time, I wondered if the real key wasn't the one in my pocket, but whether I was ready to stop seeing my brother as an opponent. And in that thought, I felt closer to Dad than I had in years. By morning, I couldn't shake the weight of the lockbox sitting on the dining table. It felt louder than silence, like it was as daring me to leave it unopened one more day. I had slept badly, dreaming of Dad's voice but never hearing the words. Every time I reached for the sound, I woke to the empty house and that box waiting like a verdict. When my brother arrived, he didn't waste time with greetings. He pulled out a chair and sat across from me, staring at it as though we were both preparing for a trial. "We can't keep circling it," he said. "We either open it or admit we're afraid." I didn't argue, because he was right. Part of me wanted to delay again, to hold on to the mystery because the unknown felt safer than the truth. But another part knew Dad never wanted us living with questions. He left us puzzles, yes, but always with the expectation that we would solve them. My hands trembled slightly as I dug the key from my pocket. It was small, ordinary, the kind you could misplace without realizing, and yet it carried the weight of our family. I slid it into the lock, and for a moment, I hesitated. "Do it," my brother whispered. The click echoed louder than I expected. I lifted the lid slowly, half expecting something dramatic, though I don't know what. Money, documents, maybe a final letter. What I found instead was a stack of manila envelopes, each labeled in Dad's handwriting. Some had our names, others had dates, and a few were marked with simple phrases like tax records or deeds. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than filing, but tucked beneath those envelopes was a smaller wooden box, worn smooth with age. I pulled it out carefully and set it between us. This, more than the paperwork, felt like the true heart of it. Inside were photographs, bundled with rubber bands, old family pictures, some I remembered, some I'd never seen. Dad as a boy, Mom holding us when we were babies, holidays that felt distant but familiar. It wasn't just an archive, it was a map of our lives, one Dad had preserved deliberately. As we sifted through them, my brother paused at one in particular. It was of the three of us, Dad in the middle, me on one side, my brother on the other. We must have been 10 or 11. Dad's hands rested on our shoulders, but what caught me was his expression. Not smiling, not stern, just watching us with a kind of guarded hope. "You see that?" my brother asked, tapping the photo. He already knew. He knew we'd need reminding. I didn't answer, because he was right. At the bottom of the photo stack lay one last envelope, sealed and heavier than the rest. My name and my brother's were written across it together. No instructions, just our names. I broke the seal carefully, and inside was a letter written in Dad's steady hand. It wasn't long, only a few paragraphs. He wrote about the property, about how the legal parts would sort themselves out with the deeds he left behind. But more than that, he wrote about us, about how he never wanted the land or the houses to divide us, how he worried that money and inheritance would become sharper than knives if we let them. And at the end, he left one line that caught in my throat when I read it aloud. "Whatever you think I left you, know that it was never the safe, or the papers, or even the land. It was each other." The silence after those words was unbearable. My brother leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, and I sat there with the letter shaking in my hands. For the first time in years, I didn't feel anger toward him. I felt something closer to grief, for everything we wasted, for the fights that now seemed so small compared to what Dad had wanted. We didn't speak for a long while. The box sat open, the photos spread out between us like a timeline. Finally, my brother said, "He's still making us work for it, isn't he?" "Yeah," I said softly, "but maybe that's the point." By the time we packed everything back into the lockbox, something had shifted. The bitterness wasn't gone, but it wasn't leading anymore. The fight over who got what felt less urgent, replaced by a different question, whether we could honor what Dad asked of us. When my brother stood to leave, he didn't slam the door like before. He paused at the threshold and said, "We'll figure it out. Together, this time." It wasn't a promise, not yet, but it was closer than we'd been in years. That night, I put the lockbox back in the garage, the same spot where Dad used to keep his tools. For the first time since the funeral, I felt like the house was breathing again. Not fixed, not healed, but alive. And maybe that was what Dad had wanted all along. The next day, I didn't expect my brother to come back so soon. I thought he'd take a week, maybe longer, to sit with what we found in the lockbox. But by afternoon, I saw his truck pulling into the driveway, and for a second, my instinct was to brace myself for another fight. Instead, he came in without his usual storm. He carried a folder under his arm and gave me a nod that felt less like a challenge and more like an invitation. "Got a minute?" he asked. I motioned to the kitchen table, the same place we'd sat the night before with Dad's photos spread between us. It struck me that the table had heard more arguments than laughter in recent years. Maybe this was its chance to carry something different. He opened the folder and slid a set of papers toward me. "These are the property records," he said. "I called the lawyer this morning to get the updated deeds. Dad was thorough. He labeled everything exactly. No surprises about who owns what." I looked through them carefully. Each parcel of land, each house, each boundary line was accounted for. What Dad had promised on paper matched what he left in the lockbox. It should have been simple, But if family was ever simple, we wouldn't be sitting here like this. "What do you want to do?" I asked him finally. He leaned back, rubbing the back of his neck. "Honestly, I don't know. My first thought was to fight for the biggest piece, the one by the lake. But after reading Dad's letter again last night," he trailed off, letting the silence carry what he didn't want to say outright, that greed had taken a back seat to something heavier. I nodded, because I felt it too. The words Dad left weren't just a reminder. They were a warning. If we let land divide us, we'd lose more than property. We'd lose the thread of family entirely. Still, that didn't solve the problem. Decisions had to be made. Bills had to be paid. Houses couldn't stay empty forever. We sat there for a while, tossing around ideas without settling on anything. Sell everything and split the money? Keep the houses in the family and rotate? Divide them evenly and hope resentment didn't creep back in later? Every option felt both fair and unfair at the same time. Finally, my brother sighed. "You know what Dad would say right now, don't you?" I smiled faintly. He'd say, "Stop dragging your feet and make a choice." "Exactly." I pushed the papers back toward him. "Then let's try this. We each take one place. No arguing over which is worth more. No second guessing. We flip a coin, and that's it." He raised an eyebrow. "That simple?" "It has to be. Otherwise we'll get lost in the numbers and forget what Dad asked of us." There was a long pause, and then he nodded. He pulled a quarter from his pocket, held it up between us, and said, "Call it." The coin spun in the air, catching the light before landing with a metallic clink on the table. Tails. My brother grinned, and for the first time in years, it wasn't a grin edged with bitterness. "Guess I get the lake," he said. I felt a flicker of jealousy, then let it go. "And I'll take the house by town," I said, "close enough for me to keep things steady." It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. After the decision, the conversation loosened. We talked about maintenance, about selling off smaller lots, about how to cover the taxes. The logistics weren't easy, but the weight of the fight was gone. It felt like we were finally planning instead of battling. At one point, my brother picked up the photo of us with Dad, the one where his hands rested on our shoulders. He studied it for a while before saying, "I think you'd be proud of this. Not the coin toss, maybe, but the fact we did it without tearing each other apart." I couldn't argue with that. By evening, we had a rough plan written down. Nothing final, but enough to start. When he stood to leave, he didn't just walk out. He stopped, put his hand on my shoulder, and said, "We'll figure the rest out. Together." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something closer to trust. That night, when I locked up the house, I didn't feel the same weight pressing down on me. For the first time since Dad's passing, I could breathe without wondering what we'd lose next. Maybe this was just the beginning of repairing what had been broken for too long. And maybe, in his own way, Dad had planned it this way all along. The night after we flipped the coin, I couldn't sleep. Not because I regretted the outcome, but because my father's words kept echoing in my head. He had always told us that property wasn't the real inheritance. It was the way we carried his lessons forward. For years, I thought those words were just something he said to ease his own worries about money. But now, sitting in the quiet house, I realized they were his final warning. I found myself walking into his old study, the one room I hadn't touched since the funeral. The desk was still scattered with his papers, his handwriting running across pages like he had just stepped out for a moment and would return any second. I sat down in his chair and let the silence press against me. That's when it struck me. This wasn't about deeds or land. It was about whether we could survive as a family without tearing each other apart. In the morning, I called my brother. "We need to do more than just divide things," I told him. "We need to rebuild something between us. Otherwise, Dad's letter means nothing." There was a pause on the line before he said, "What do you suggest?" I suggested we go together to the lawyer, not to fight, but to finalize the arrangement as a united front. No tricks, no hidden moves, just a commitment that whatever came next, we'd handle it without dragging the family name through mud. Walking into that office together was harder than I expected. The lawyer gave us a look like he wasn't sure whether to prepare for another argument or a breakthrough. We explained what we'd decided: the coin toss, the division, the plan to sell smaller parcels and split the earnings. My brother even added that we wanted the will filed with no contest clause, so there'd be no grounds for future disputes. The lawyer leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. "I've been doing this work a long time," he said. "I don't often see brothers settle things this cleanly. You'd be surprised how many families burn everything down over less." I caught my brother's eye. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like we were opponents across a battlefield. I felt like we were two tired men trying to honor the same father. Afterward, we stopped by the diner on the edge of town. It was the same place Dad used to take us when we were kids after long days working the land. The waitress remembered us, which surprised me, and she said, "Your father was a good man. He'd be glad to see you here." We sat at that booth for hours, talking about things we hadn't talked about in years. Not just property or money, but memories. The time Dad patched the roof with us in the rain, the way he always made too much food at Thanksgiving, the arguments he had with Mom that never seemed to last more than a night. It wasn't easy. Some memories hurt, and some silences between us still felt fragile, but I could feel something shifting. We weren't two men clawing at each other anymore. We were brothers, trying, however imperfectly, to step out of the shadow of our father's death. That evening before heading home, my brother said, "I don't know if we'll ever get this completely right, but I don't want to lose what little we've rebuilt." "Neither do I answered, and I meant it. When I finally walked back into my father's house, I stood in the hallway for a long time. The quiet didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt like a kind of peace. I realized then that this was my real inheritance. Not the house, not the land, not even the photos in the lockbox. It was the chance to carry forward the dignity my father lived with, even in the face of hardship. I don't know what the years ahead will bring. My brother and I stumble again. Old wounds don't close overnight, but I know now that family doesn't survive by winning or losing. It survives by showing up, even when the past has left scars. That was my father's final gift, and I intend to keep it. When I look back now, I realize it was never just about money, property, or even family roles. It was about being heard. Too often age makes people invisible in their own homes, but silence doesn't mean surrender. Every choice I made in this journey was not about punishing anyone, but about reclaiming dignity. And perhaps that's the most powerful inheritance we can leave behind: the courage to stand tall when others expect you to shrink. But what happened inside that lawyer's office changed everything. Because while today felt like an ending, the truth is, it wasn't. One envelope, sealed in my hand, carried words no one else expected to hear. When I placed it on the table, the entire room froze. Not a cough, not a whisper, just silence so heavy it pressed against the walls. If you want to know what made that silence so unbearable, you'll want to stay with me a little longer. The moment that envelope opened, well, that's where the real story began.